Hey again, everyone. Welcome to our next episode of Imperialism and World War I. Before we move on, let's once again look at scenes from our last episode. First thing we talked about was the impact of the Roosevelt Corollary. Remember that it was an addendum to the Monroe Doctrine that was established back in 1823. Why was that? Well, President Roosevelt felt that it was the U.S. duty to, quote, civilize countries like the Philippines in order to not only spread our culture, but to increase our power in the eyes of other imperialist countries. Next, we discussed how William Howard Taft's dollar diplomacy was a change from Roosevelt's policy. Dollar diplomacy was less about military power and more about economics. If we get countries to be dependent on us financially, then we can control them better. Finally, we discussed Woodrow Wilson and his moral diplomacy. In this case, we just refused to accept countries that we felt were mistreating its people. We would even use force if necessary to make sure countries were, quote, behaving. And we did that in Mexico. Okay, well, let's get to our new episode, World War I Abroad. Before we go on, I want to ask you a question. Why would the U.S. want to get involved in a war on the other side of the Atlantic over 3,000 miles away? What do you think? Take a minute and write this down in your notes. Well, the war in Europe had numerous causes. And if you look at the chart here, you can see that we have divided these reasons into four: military, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Militarily, many countries had built up their armed forces and increased their technology as well. With so many countries having strong armies and navies, it was going to be very deadly if they ever had to use them. Well, it happened, and millions died as a result. Another issue is the alliance system that was going on at the time. A lot of countries had signed treaties with a number of other countries to help protect themselves and to try to prevent a war from breaking out. The hope was that the countries would see that if they attacked another country, they would have to fight all the other countries that had allied with that country they attacked. The problem is, it only takes one country to attack, and then all the countries would have to fight because they promised to support each other in those treaties. Another cause of the war was the continuing hunger of countries to grow their empires. It became a kind of competition to see who would have the biggest empire. Remember, when this happens, the countries being taken over are not going to just let it happen without a fight. Finally, we have what is known as nationalism. And this is just basically a form of being overly, quote, proud and patriotic towards your country. It doesn't sound like a bad thing, but what it turns into is having a false sense that your country is better than others in every way, including culturally and racially. And that can cause a lot of problems, obviously. If you take a look at the map here, you will see how the alliance system could cause problems. You have Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which is now Turkey, all allied with each other as well as a few others. And then you have France, Russia, Great Britain, and Serbia, among others, allied with each other. And notice that the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire are surrounded by the others. And this is going to get ugly when Serbia and Austria-Hungary have a problem. Right now, I'd like you to write down in your notes 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages of being part of an alliance. Pause the video while you do that. The war will begin because of issues in the Balkan states. It was a concern prior to the war starting, and it was not a coincidence that this region was called the powder keg of Europe. It all came to a head on June 28, 1914, when the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife were assassinated by a Serbian rebel. Once that happened, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and the dominoes began to fall. And once Austria-Hungary declared war, the alliance system, instead of protecting countries, turned deadly. Take a look at this video on the assassination and write down at least 2 facts in your notes. Here's how the dominoes fell. Russia, being an ally of Serbia, declared war on Austria-Hungary. After that, Germany declared war on Russia because Germany was an ally of Austria-Hungary. Then Great Britain declared war on Germany because Britain was allied with Russia and France, who had already gotten involved because of their alliance with Russia. As you can see, there was no turning back now, and it was going to get ugly. The hope on the German side was to quickly defeat France and then turn east to defeat Russia. It was not to be. The war would become a long, arduous time of deadly battles for the next 4 years. What were some of the impacts of the war? Well, one of them was the development of trench warfare. Trench warfare was just what it implies. Armies would dig deep trenches and hide in them to avoid bombs and gunfire. Every now and then, the soldiers would be ordered over the top to attack the enemy. With the improved technology of machine guns and mortars, thousands of soldiers would be killed each time they attempted to overtake the enemy's trenches. When soldiers went over the top, they crossed what was known as no man's land. And as you can see in the pictures here, it was a desolate place that had no living plant or animal life because of the bombing and gunfire. Thousands of men were killed and lay dead in no man's land after each attempt to cross the desolation. Please watch the video here to see more about trench warfare and write down at least 2 interesting facts in your notes. To put trench warfare into perspective, and to put World War I into perspective, the Battle of the Somme, which lasted from July to November of 1916, cost the two sides in the war over 1.2 million lives. That was more in that one battle than nearly all the battles of all the wars ever fought up to that point in history. Insane. These photos are just a few taken to help put what it was like to fight in the trenches into perspective. Right here, you can see what could happen if you did not take care of your feet during the war. Trench foot was an affliction that occurred many times and was a tremendous issue for soldiers. Look at the picture at the top right where you can see how muddy the bottom of the trench was. The feet on the left were caused by spending too much time in mud like that. Now let's talk about how the U.S. was feeling about the war early on. Remember, we weren't fighting then. The people of this country did not want to be involved in a war overseas. Of course, some people supported fighting, though not always on the same side. Many Americans wanted to support whatever their homeland country was. So obviously German Americans supported Germany, and Austria-Hungary Americans supported Austria-Hungary, and French Americans, British Americans supported the Allies. Many Americans supported the Allies mainly because so many of them shared our culture, such as Great Britain. Also, we had a stronger economic relationship with the Allies during the war. Because of that, most wanted the Allies to win, but not enough to join the fight. Things began to change when the British started to blockade Germany. The U.S. wanted to continue trade with Britain and Germany, but did not go against the British blockade. And this caused tremendous hardships on Germany, and the Germans began to feel that they needed to do something about it. The beginning of the U.S. becoming directly involved in the war was the sinking of the British cruise ship Lusitania. The Germans believed the Lusitania was carrying weapons to Britain, and they may very well have been. And so their U-boats or submarines sank her. The problem was there were 128 Americans on board that were killed. The American people were furious with the Germans. The Germans continued to attack vessels in the Atlantic after the Lusitania sinking, using unrestricted submarine warfare. And as long as the British continued their blockade, the Germans would continue that warfare. The Germans let the U.S. know they would stop if the British ended their blockade. Check out this video on the sinking of the Lusitania and write down why you think it did not put the U.S. into the war right away. The other event that happened that helped push the U.S. into the war against the Germans was the infamous Zimmermann Note. In this note from the German foreign minister to Mexico, the Germans stated that if the Germans won the war, if the Americans got into the war, they would ensure that Mexico got back Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. This was all the proof many Americans needed that the Germans were not on our side and helped push the U.S. closer to declaring war on Germany. Finally, on April 2, 1917, after the Germans continued with their unrestricted submarine warfare, the U.S. officially joined the Allies and declared war on Germany. Now it was really a world war. In Wilson's speech, he used the fact that Germany was sinking our ships and killing our people already. and that war had to happen. Wilson even admitted that the right to democracy required the sacrifice of young men to continue its success. As you can see, there were many more countries on the Allied side than on the Central Power side. So it was going to be an uphill battle for the Germans and its three friends. And in the end, it was too much. Look at this map and you can see which countries around the world were part of the Allied cause. It really truly was a world war. Once the U.S. joined the war, the first thing they were able to do right away was involve the Navy. Part of this was to help convoy supplies to Britain and France. As you can see in this depiction, the warships would surround the unarmed ships carrying the supplies and would attack any U-boat that would attempt to sink the supply ship. It didn't work every time, but it cut down the number of ships sunk by Germans a tremendous amount. The Allies also set up mines in the North Atlantic to curtail German submarines. By 1918, the Germans were having very little success and were not able to replace their losses. The arrival of the U.S. also had a huge positive effect on the other Allied countries. It not only gave them additional troops to help them fight, but it also gave them fresh faces and fresh attitudes, which helped improve morale for countries that had lost hundreds of thousands of men in battle. The leader of the Americans was General John J. Pershing, who, if you remember, was the man who led the search for Pancho Villa back in 1916. In this video, I want you to see how the U.S. entry into the war changed the future of the entire world. When the Americans arrived, they were mortified at the conditions the other Allied troops were dealing with. In this quote from a U.S. soldier, he discusses how complex and large the trenches were, as well as the low morale of the Allied troops. It wasn't surprising considering the number of men that had been killed in the war up to that point. The war had another effect on those involved. Technology had a tremendous impact on the fighting and was one of the main reasons so many men lost their lives. High speed and much more accurate machine guns, large tanks, the early use of airplanes, and maybe worst of all, the use of poison gas, all were major factors in the war. These new technologies changed the way war was waged. They were way ahead of the technology that would help protect from these things, and that is why so many men died. We just didn't know how to handle the changes. Check out this video on technology, write down a couple more facts that you learned. What happened with a lot of these changes were the hazards of disease, poison gas, lack of sleep. These caused thousands of deaths in the war. Some battles, more people lost their lives from that than the actual battle themselves. The constant bombarding of trenches caused a new phenomenon as well. It was known as shell shock. Shell shock was what we now call PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. This happened when men emotionally collapsed from the wear of battle. Do you know anyone that has served, that has struggled since coming home? It still happens today. Finally, we've reached the final months of the war. First, in 1917, Russia drops out after having their revolution where the communists took over. On November 3rd, 1918, Austria-Hungary surrenders, and finally, at 11/11, on 11/11/18, Germany officially surrenders, ending World War I. When the war ended, there were nearly 20 million dead worldwide. It was by far the deadliest war in world history up to that point, and it was not even close. The U.S. lost more than 110,000 men, and we were only in the war for 19 months. In the U.S., we began celebrating the ending of the war, calling it Armistice Day in 1919. In 1954, we changed the name to Veterans Day, and we celebrate that day every day to this day, every year. Did you know that here in Wilmington, we had a number of men that served in World War I? 37 of them gave their lives in the war. If you go down to the waterfront, to Riverfront Park, you will see a memorial statue to those that lost their lives in World War I. The statue was built in 1922 and was located in front of New Hanover High School for many years before being moved to the waterfront in 2014. Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks for listening, and I hope you took good notes. Stay tuned to our next episode when we talk about World War I here on the home front. Thanks.